what is consciousness?
Mm. A word, or with a finger pointing at the moon, and an attempt of coordinating and sense making around something we believe to be fundamental, and I believe might probably be fundamental to nature itself. And I would tend to think of consciousness on multiple levels, kind of like an onion or a tree, where it re enters in different ways as ways of knowing. And this seems to be consistent with the polysemia of the way we use it. We haven't settled on a single use of the word. And so we're kind of negotiating what we mean by consciousness based on the different people who have contribute ideas of different degrees of being well fleshed out or useful or have particular interests. But I would go maybe back to like a kind of like maybe something even before consciousness, like something like predictive information or a capacity for modeling or mind. And then ways that this information can be organized to actually represent in different ways, maybe with things like explicit representation. And then if this representational system can have, I've suggested, spatial, temporal, and causal coherence with respect to something like an integrative self-world model, then this basically iterative state estimation of self and world, of system and world, in different configurations, that seems to be roughly what people mean by a stream of experience. But then people keep going, and these are also good uses of the word consciousness. So things like, system to AI or self-consciousness, the ability of a system to be aware of itself in a strange loop type fashion, which would then, and across all these levels, you're going to get like interactions as you go up and as you go down, and in terms of like the nature of your higher level knowledge of you will then influence the stream of experience and how it unfolds and vice versa. And so we can keep going up to maybe, at the pinnacle that our monkey brains are capable of handling, something like self-reflexive, autonoetic self-consciousness, and things of that nature. And then we can go all the way back to something where it's like, should we call it consciousness or not? And then we debate about it. I tend to take a kind of intermediate position that's slightly panpsychist in that there might be a certain intelligence around everything that somehow manages to temporarily skirt the second law while serving in everything it does. I'm butchering the thermodynamics, but the idea of like the fact that things exist is, how the heck do they do that? How do they keep thinking? How do they not get like mixed up in the meat grinder of existence? Some kind of predictive information they seem to be able to leverage. So some kind of, you could call it mind-like thing, intelligence modeling. Do you want to call that consciousness? Not sure. Do you want to call it psyche? Maybe. Depends how you want to use words. And so in general, I'm in favor of like just adding words and then being clear about what we mean by our word conjunctions and what possible worlds we're picking out, and then pegging it to the discourse we're having. And they seem like multiple good discourses, and I don't like to say like, you should use the word this way and not that way. Who the heck am I to
Yeah.
say that? So for me, the place I focus on consciousness is on what would it take to generate a stream of experience from a point of view. How do you get a system to have a something like an egocentric reference frame, and this structuring a generative process of filling in likely sensory states conditioned on a causal transition model and a self-world model.
Mm.
That's roughly
Yeah,
how.
yeah. Well, we can dig deeper into it, but I like that you start it off thinking about step back, because we look at the discussions of consciousness and we see that we seem to be talking about many different things, and people might use the word in different ways, and then saying, well, what does that tell us about consciousness, about the things and the different kinds of experiences we use the word consciousness to denote. And so it's interesting. If I would like to dig more into the way in which it kind of gets built up, then there's we don't need, there's not like a magic source that it's somehow, well, maybe there are transition points we can see, but there seems to be some way in which it must be it must come about through some sort of proto like a smaller level of consciousness, and that there are kind of degrees. So what would you say to that?
The transition question is vexing in terms of when we should think in terms of something like phase changes or major transitions, and when we should be looking for continuity. I'm not. I tend to think that there are differences of degree that become differences of kind. There are new regimes that get established when systems achieve the ability to look back on themselves in certain ways, and there are qualitative differences where the parts so configured are doing things that they were not doing before. Now that they are organized into a new kind of whole. That being said, like I would never want to abandon like life mind continuity, and I would never want to assume some sort of like, even if it feels compelling, like that basically, like if something feels like a difference in kind, that is a natural kind of something, that like natural selection selected that as a mechanism, and there's something new that's happening. Not sure, but I guess the you would need. I tend to think that most of what people have said is valuable, and so like let's say you're talking like a recurrent processing theorist. Yes, absolutely. So at some point, like the system would have to be able to have rich enough recurrent dynamics that you could get something like a multi-scale rhythmic hierarchy of patterns that could achieve closure in a certain way that could both basically that it could do iterative state estimation, that could both inform and be informed by perception action cycles on the time scale of their formation. Now, you might not be able to get that if you're like below some critical threshold, that you're actually getting these like estimates generated quickly enough that they're letting you surf uncertainty in that way, giving you these like, I think this. It might be that some systems, like even though there is useful predictive information, they're not generating the kind of data structure you want that would basically get this handshake with reality that could, and then build in richness in that way, that the world model could be built up by interfacing with the world itself. There will be predictive information, but the intuition is that there's a certain special kind where I can now organize this relative to my coherent sensorium, where all my different modalities and the ways that they interrelate, I'm doing a good job of tracking them. I might be doing something like Rudolph has good work on describing like projected geometric modeling, but the idea of like establishing the a perspectival reference frame to organize them. My sensors are pointing out this way. There's a certain geometry that should be expected. And so not all systems would be capable of generating, for instance, like data structures to take that all into account and bind it into a neat way where basically you could get something like these state estimates that would potentially feel like there would be something that it feels like. So I guess the take so like with the hard problem, you can always say, well, why doesn't just this happen in the dark? Why isn't it state estimation? But I think if you like dig into like what you're looking for the data structure, for like what is it that you're filling in? If you're specifically talking about filling in a sensorium in particular ways in different contexts, I feel like a little bit of the force of the hard problem kind of gets softened. And that it's like, so if you just go from like math or words like modeling to experience, of course, that seems like a giant flailing leap over an explanatory gap, because it is. But if what you've done is you've established enough bridging principles that you're describing how you are generating a sensorium like yours, and the different combinations that you experience it, are the different combinations that are familiar to you, I think that's what we're talking about when we say, wait, why is there something that it feels like? And it's the feels, the specific feels. So in terms of like the gradient issue, there could be, going back even before the universe, like it is the story of the origin of the universe of some kind of mindedness, some kind of modeling property, some sort of mutual information that can build on itself. And so you could push psyche throughout the whole freaking thing, but actually get something like I don't want to say a movie in your head, but for a world to appear to a being from a point of view and to have it be a stream of experience. I believe this is an adaptation that's useful for cybernetic control. I think it's the essential thing we're going to need to focus on for things like psychiatry and eventually for artificial intelligence. And so there's value in the panpsychist move, I think, of looking at the life-mind continuity, the way that these aren't always necessarily distinct, that some of these properties are elsewhere that can be realized by other means. And there's preconditions for the game to work at all in terms of things like a self-organizing survival system. We wouldn't even be talking about like building brains otherwise, but I still tend to be a little bit more, I guess, conservative than some of my panpsychist brethren, that I'm thinking like there were some major transitions for particular adaptations. Like life took its sweet time before it made us. Like this kind of intelligence did not just like drop onto the scene with this degree of complexity. Like something weird happened when we got to like things like mammalian and avian brains. Something different happened when we became symbolic. Something, yeah.
I like so many things you said there, but one is in trying to draw on different perspectives. I mean, I would like to even think about modern theories of consciousness and then see where we can get at by trying to almost combine them. But one thing is that you mentioned feeling, and Mark Solms, who I've had on this podcast, and he talks about feeling and emotions being sort of at the heart of consciousness and being kind of crucial to it. But I've even on the panpsychist note, I even heard him speaking recently with Michael Levin, and in them kind of thinking about the information processing that might even go on in like cells, but even even algorithms, even like small simple computer based things. Like he was kind of having to like jump and just see where does his word of emotions mean, if he's kind of meaning it as a kind of a very specific information laden thing about a certain thing. It's in a way it was kind of blurring the distinction. Maybe very low level things could have a kind of emotion. So I'm interested to kind of think where we should go. The importance of emotions, the importance of a kind of perspective, the importance of integrated information. How could we kind of put all this together?
Mark is one of like the people I like most agree with and disagree with in the world. Like it's like so like on the functional level, like I just everything he says, I'm just like it's the core of the issues, I feel. We just diverge on like what we think on like plausible mechanistic realizers are, and that would inform what we think is going on at the algorithmic level to some degree, to the extent that you can factor these things out. But so, for instance, like taking concepts like a kind of valence or a valuing, a kind of intelligence in terms of like, or a modeling capacity combined to a certain sentience, and maybe a sentience or in terms of like a valuing, like a modeling ability and a valuing based on survival. And these coming together in a way that keeps the whole game going in an autopoietic fashion. That seems so right to me. And this story doesn't necessarily, it doesn't come, it's before big brains. It goes back to like individual cells. Like, I think there's a beautiful parallelism between like Nick Lane's work describing like in his book Transformer, when he's talking about the Krebs cycle, is this like valuation, this value estimation dynamo. And then it's almost exactly the same as Mark's account of what the brainstem is doing in terms of the organismic survival, moment-to-moment precision weighting. And I think it's amazing. The one thing I would part ways, or one thing I would like to suggest, but we're kind of back to like way people use words, is like I would like to distinguish between conscious and unconscious emotions and feelings. So we can argue over like what the most common like patterns of linguistic use are and what like the neatest breakdowns are that would be most useful going forward. But so I tend to view feelings and emotions almost like a kind of perception action cycle, where it's like emotions are the change in the organismic mode could be thought of as a kind of like prior on your or hyper prior on your behavior of saying, this, I think I'm in this class of situations. I have this set of like policies preloaded, this set of action readiness as like near harmonics or near resonances from my current eigen mode. But basically, you get into this state of readiness for this class of events. And then from that inaction of there to maintain it, there's a perceptual component. And if you can bundle it right, maybe it's even so you maybe call that a feeling. But not all of them would be when you get to that level of abstraction, I'm not sure even how coherent action perception cycles are, but still I still think of it kind of in those terms. But the idea though of like conscious versus unconscious, that a single cell going into a sporulated form, or extending like you can think of that as a kind of like a fear mode, or like releasing endotoxins as a kind of like aggression mode, or extending a pilus even as a kind of like lust mode, in terms of you are now so configured that your affordance structure is different than it was before. And there would be some kind of feedback on this process because you need that for anything to work well. And to the extent you can separate out feelings and emotions, I don't know. But the thing you could take different moves, but I love the idea of taking valence and seeing how it's fundamental to all of this autopoietic modeling. And so like I want to be able to push like feelings and or some so affect down lower, but I don't necessarily believe that there is something that it feels like to be a system doing that. It's in terms of its cybernetic significance, it's the same. It has the same evolutionary logic about it. It's vital. It's truly vital, but it's not necessarily. The debate is for any system that has modeling plus valence. What is it like? Is there an extra thing it takes for there to be basically a move from I guess you'd say, a third person to a first person ontology? And we would then invoke something like, now this thing has a point of view where we would say, yeah, there is something that it feels like. As opposed, yeah.
Yeah, I like that. No, if I see what you mean, you can point to the thing that we call emotions in terms of like the dynamical system sense of what it's doing, and you could imagine like, does that necessarily have to be felt? You could have that important sort of thing which sort of like sets the scene for other things to go on that emotions do for us and that we feel, but maybe they could go on not even unconsciously, but in almost an agent which maybe has no kind of feeling. It's funny because Mark Solms would he does define emotion as something which always has to be felt. But then it's weird because if you think about things like people like Freud, who he likes a lot, I guess they kind of, for him, I just think surely there are kind of like unconscious feelings that we don't feel, but we sometimes can get access to. But I think that then brings us back to the question of what consciousness is, because you could then argue, well, maybe even everything we call the unconscious, I've seen some arguments of maybe those are like similar enough dynamics to consciousness, and then there are ways, and like for example, listening to Bernardo Kastrup, who's not necessarily more of a philosopher but he thinks mind is fundamental, and he's kind of arguing like the thing we think of as consciousness is just the kind of the exact mode of everything coming together, and but everything is conscious in mind. I mean, everything is mind to him, and we can get to those other places. It's just those are vaguer because they're not directly related to. There are some salience, relevance. There are things which make the current thing we're looking at consciousness. But for him at least, and he's an idealist, and I'm complicating things bringing him in, but to him as well, we can get to maybe any kind of part of mind, and everything is kind of dissociation. So just like we might be in our consciousness related to what we would perceive as our unconscious, to him there would be kind of collective unconscious that we could also access. Anyway, that's kind of complicating things being done. But what do you think about this thinking about emotions and what we mean by the unconscious and the conscious in that light?
I mean, I think that's a really good point. With like, even within a Freudian framework, like people will be having these emotional expressions, or you would say they're unconscious. Maybe in terms of like, so just in general, I just think for so many of these debates, we just need more words. Like, and we shouldn't try to like wrestle each other into like submission on how we use like a smaller set of words. I mean, there's a reasonable thing. Like we can no more than three, maybe like in terms of like 3-word constructions or something. But like, I just feel like we'd fight a lot less if we just made, and we'd think better if we made room for like more granular constructions. So like, so for instance, like, am I thinking for like something like an unconscious, you can kind of think of it maybe in at least two ways. So one might be like something never enters into the state estimation process for system and world on the time scales at which it achieves closure, such that it's meaningfully represented within there. So it's sort of like I might, like, let's say, have information coming into my nervous system and my body and brain, my overall thing, and it like there might be, it might not make it, it might have a meaningful impact on shaping events, but it didn't get its votes in at the time when like this rich club was talking very intensely with itself, and then you know uh, having these explosive percolation events that might entail something like exchange of information and state estimation. But the idea is like the information might not have gotten there. There never was anything that it felt like, but it's still like impacting. It's still like pulling on you. Like maybe it tickled your amygdala a little bit, but it wasn't like actually showing up in like any sort of quail state. I just used the quail word. But there's like another where it's like maybe there was something that it was like, but like in terms of like self consciousness or self aware consciousness, not self, but like autonoetic in terms of like uh, kind of like frames in a movie, but you don't like remember all of them. They're happening so fast, and it's like only if like there's a meaningful causal dependency between the frames that one can refer back to the other and point back to the other, that maybe you can like catch the thing and remember it. But there could be a lot of things that are happening where there was something that I felt like in the moment, maybe even like little sequence fragments, but they just lacked enough coherence to be taken up into the rest. And so these could have a powerful impact on your behavior, a rich unconscious, using your full agent, not full, but using a lot of your agent model, a lot of your world model, but you're not catching it. So the idea of conscious versus unconscious, like emotions, I really like that because I really want the life mind continuity, and maybe even like algorithm life, algorithm mind continuity too. Like Mike's work with like the sorting algorithms even. Um, I'm perfectly happy to use the language of valence there. It's just I have this. I think what we mean by consciousness actually is very central for a certain type of cybernetic control that we really value, whether we're talking about psychiatry or engineering AIs. And so I want to basically, I want the insight of the life mind continuity and the ways in which both like life itself can inform what we know about mind, but also like the nature of life as a valuing modeling process. I want to preserve all that, and maybe even before life, in terms of like algorithmic dynamics for which there are algorithmic abstraction layers that could be meaningfully be applied, implicit search processes, and an entailed information geometry and an organismic semantics even before organisms potentially. But I feel like this particular configuration that let us be like the VR AR system in our head, this waking dream, that bit in terms of like there might be a phase transition of getting that good enough that it's basically good for robotics, for meat robots. And then this being one of the central things that we're talking about and taking care of in terms of our own autonomy, our own freedom, capacity to exist in the world, to share meanings, that it's a very useful thing. There's a dissociation between intelligence and consciousness, clearly. You can have a lot of intelligence without consciousness, but I still think consciousness is very, very useful for the intelligence of being an agent in the world, staying on top of your action perception cycles as they unfold in real time. And so I want to have like conceptually the inclusiveness, but I am a little more conservative because I want to have a separate conversation that is informed by the others of this basically self-world modeling system. Like what kind of architectural features we're talking about and what type of data structures we're talking about that could correspond to something like the core aspects of our subjective experience and the ways they play into our lives and our shared lives.
I maybe a cool direction would be to, given that have up in the air lots of different concepts about cognition, intelligence, and consciousness, if we could think about AI and how to think about their intelligent capacities, and to what degree might something be intelligent versus like generally intelligent, what we even mean by something having a kind of general intelligence, which again, of course, is going to have a bearing on what we mean by our own intelligence. So, where would you want to start in saying anything about trying to replicate our intelligence in AI?
I mean, again, I find myself with like the words problem, and that like I see merit in a lot of the ways people use different words, and because each one has its own frames associated with it, and its own baggage, its own affordances, and so I guess in terms of intelligence, so you have like the Shane and Legg definition of like the ability to achieve goals over a broad range of environments. And then you have like Chalet talking about like the ability to like learn new things above and beyond your training data, given your core priors. And I kind of like, and maybe like Carl might say something like, capacity for predictive modeling and like structure learning or something like this. But like to do good learning and inference, that's your intelligence. Like like how intelligent you are is how successful are you at minimizing your free energy. It kind of combines a lot of them in terms of like uh, staying alive as the kind of system you are is going to be helpful for achieving goals across a broad range of environments. And for the environments you're in to achieve those goals, given the good regulator theorem, it's probably a good idea to have some kind of model. You will need some kind of modeling information, some kind of sort of tracking of the likely dynamics of that system. So how to think of intelligence with respect to AI? I tend to think of it in terms of how good are you at modeling and learning, and I view this as compatible with like the other goals of like the other formulations because of the good regulator theorems. Like Shane Legg's seems about right, Chalet's seems about right, and so consciousness, I believe, would be very useful for intelligence in terms of allowing you in the moment. One way of achieving goals in an environment is you're in the environment, you need to adjust your behavior. And so like in any given moment, let's say I know where I am, what's around me. I have things emphasized or de-emphasized based on their likely importance. And so I basically have an attention weighted, where the top-down attention is coming largely also based on my organismic needs that I think would be likely to be realized now in terms of what's more in the foreground or background where things are likely to have more purchase. And I have basically this coherent structure of what's going on in a moment that gives me bearings, that lets me basically inform and be informed by action perception cycles on the time scales at which they form. So allowing me to nuance this exchange with the world. So that's a very useful thing. But then when we get to like these higher forms of consciousness also, so now we want to plan. And so we would want, it's not clear that you need something like this lower level. It might be necessary for the upper levels. But something, I have this work on like the hippocampal system that I've done with very talented roboticists, Tim Verbaelen and Ozan Katal. And what they're trying to do is basically model a agent moving through the world, estimating its views and its poses at any given point, and keeping track of its trajectory. And this is also very useful for achieving goals in a broad range of environments. And the same system also might have been, it appears to have been repurposed for high-level thought as a kind of navigation through conceptual space. So it's the multiple senses of consciousness that people use seem to me to be, all of them almost, really important for intelligence, but in different ways. And so that's part of the, again, I just feel like if we added more words, we would have like a finer set of granular discussions. And so, yes, it's true that intelligence and consciousness are separable in a way. You have, high and low of each. But that doesn't mean for our attempts at like making our circumstances better by understanding ourselves or to build systems that can help us, that there isn't a interesting and important dependency between these things. So
I was talking to Maxwell Ramstead at Versus AI and researcher into active inference a couple of days ago, and we were speaking about AI and what LLMs are doing, and he, coming from working with Carl Friston on in the active inference framework, and he kind of thinks, yes, there is a kind of inference going on when you're with the LLMs when you're training it. At least that's kind of when it's accessing data, but then after it's kind of doing these rounds of inference on words, then it kind of, as he says it comes out dead to you, and you're using it. And it's not that it's an amazing tool, but it's kind of stopped doing inference. It's stopped doing that when you're actually using it, as amazing as it is. And he, the way he was thinking about it is, can we get machines to be doing that kind of inference on the go? And just from hearing you speaking about it, that might then like start seeming a little more like consciousness, because if it's again in real time, can you point out salient things? Can you be, as a system, pulling those all together so there's a kind of coherence to that? And yeah, it's interesting though. Let's jump in if you want. But he kind of was talking about how, in a way, maybe there isn't like not we need to rethink what we mean by general intelligence, and that any kind of inference we do is kind of specialized. Like we have maybe specialized units in the brain for different computations, and maybe what we even think by general like is actually not that general, and there are very specific kind of pattern recognition systems. So then when I think about in that like what consciousness is that then the ability to bring many kinds of computational systems together, but then see how nevertheless they can be coherent towards different aims. So yeah, I've said a lot, and I don't know if any of this really makes sense, but yeah, do you have any thoughts on this?
I mean, it makes a lot of
Okay.
sense. Like, so I guess a couple live things. One would be like, what do we think is going on with these LLMs, and the way in which intelligence, to what degree is it useful to think of something like general intelligence, as opposed to thinking of all the specific kind of situations that we find ourselves in where there's specific modeling tasks and specific subsystems that are fit for the job, of basically helping you to nuance that exchange, and like and where and I guess maybe no free lunches, but like optimizing in one direction means you're not optimizing in others, and so I guess I'll comment on that and then loop back around to LLMs. I guess I'd want both, and you see in a way both are kind of reflected in this idea of a workspace architecture, where it's like you have like the power is like a lot of specialist subsystems that are separately optimizable to be different things and to help with, like, for instance, like the problem of trade-offs, and that once you optimize in one direction, it's a multi-objective. Now, there's other objectives that you're going to be compromised potentially if they're not considered in that optimization. But if you can go modular and separate the systems, you can separately optimize them on their own terms, and then you create some sort of higher level adjudication or synergistic process that can bring them together. And so, well, in that case, it's like, in general, I want to have it all. So it's like, I want the like domain specific specialists, and I want the domain general processes that can like integrate across and provide lingua francas of inference and learning. So this idea of a workspace is that basically there's some sort of information, there's some sort of overall architecture and way the data structures are organized, that specialist subsystems can have a meeting place to be legible to each other, and to degrees, but at least be able to be in coordination, to have synergy across their different functions, to be able to update each other meaningfully. And so there does seem to be something like a connection between something fairly domain general and, I'd say, consciousness, things like general intelligence and things like the integrative functions of consciousness. I think there is a connection there. But okay, so loop around the language models. So I think that's well said. Like I think Maxwell's account is a good one. It's a very strange thing. It's like you can do a remarkable amount with this like one pass, but the separation of the learning and the inference those phases, it does hamstring these systems for things like autonomy. And I guess in terms of, like if I introspect, which I sometimes do, uh, it seems like some of the power of language in terms of how much we can do with how little is because of a kind of like a dual code. So like there's a sense in which like the syntactic order is just good at next token prediction, and the words are coming to my mouth and mind without me choosing them. It's just like I'm really good at like this, what symbol is going to be next. But at the same time, in parallel, there's this basically this emulation environment, this game engine in my head that this generative model of that I'm inverting of what would be likely given what's being said. And these are kind of going in parallel with I think a fruitful separability, that we're like hallucinating wildly as we talk to each other. And this is the fact that the syntactic order can pull itself along without us even attending to it and choosing what to say, but like being informed by it, but having its own intelligence about it. But it is of a but as it operates, though, it can operate, it seems, in real time with this other sensory order, whether with this not just this a syntactic order, but a kind of the grounding of the symbols in our inner simulation environment. So this doesn't seem to be present in language models, and some of the and because of this, it's not clear like how robust like things like their causal reasoning are. Or could be, without having this kind of real-time operation of a kind of multi-code for an agent that would actually, the grounding might actually, I believe, end up being important if we want to use these systems, have them be reliable enough and powerful enough for something like AGI. That doesn't mean they're not like a fourth industrial revolution. They might change everything still, but I tend to agree that these systems are not likely to be sufficient for AGI. And we can say multimodality, but I want to and I guess you could say what I'm describing is a kind of multimodality, but it's different than just pictures. It's actually the ability to invert the full sensorium of an embodied agent that has been embedded in a world. And so it's not just the syntactic order is not just pointing at a set of images, but it's pointing at basically a system that has learned the causal structure of the world through interacting with the world and then can imagine novel causal configurations. That's the thing I think we don't have. And it's not clear we get that even just by adding another kind of matrix and letting them gently rub up against each other with our supercomputers and power plants. We might actually need something like developmental robotics, potentially in like a virtual world, but something like that to actually get the power.
Yeah, it's interesting that you would kind of point to how in the way we wield language, there's a kind of aliveness to the symbols. I was reading Douglas Hofstadter recently about the way in which there are symbols of like what words mean. They're constantly being changing, and even what they are themselves are not reducible to any lower order thing that's like a data store that we're going and accessing, or the word for cat, but rather a thing which is constantly changing depending on how we use it. And that would make more sense in terms of the way we understand the world. We have this intelligence which we're not we can be pretty dumb sometimes, but we're not like robots, and we just kind of get confused completely about what someone's referring to. The concepts are very changeable. It's interesting. I was hearing John Vervaeke, the cognitive scientist, talk about the way in which we encode relevance, this very situated definedness of words in the way we use it in our language, and that then like large language models kind of get that for free. They kind of use the power that we've had to be able to form really coherent sentences and then use that. But that I almost want to then ask about that, is that him and Jonathan Pajot were kind of a bit in a way concerned, like, because you talked about the power there of symbols in our language, and even though it doesn't seem to have that in the way we would, but there's a weird way in which it has maybe a different access to symbols, because and maybe one which could actually make it in some ways more powerful than us, because it's getting like every time words being used on the internet, anytime people have been trying to form coherent sentences, it's going to be able to see patterns in that. And like the way Jonathan Pajot was talking about it is a way in which, we don't understand, our own drives, our own motivations, and that's all going to be there locked up in our language. So to me, these kind of things are fascinating. Like it's a kind of intelligence, but we almost have to kind of understand, as we've been trying to do here, what it means then to be able to have passed sort of all these words and to be able to generate like links between them all. I don't know, if to frame that in a question, but like again, I'm kind of want to contrast the intelligence that LLMs have to a kind of our own intelligence, and again, it kind of gets to the crux of the matter. They have a kind of understanding of the world that's in semantics, and to what degree, could you try and embody an LLM? To what degree do you kind of need firsthand sort of actual experience to be, it's interesting because, one more thing is that these LLMs with a very small amount of training on images, they can start creating images. So that's a really weird one. The structure in language itself is weirdly translatable to the structure in images. And the same huge models that are using LLMs can now construct images. So what then is hidden within LLMs? What stores of how information, knowledge, and understanding sort of like work are in that? Something I've heard Stephen Wolfram kind of talk a little bit about too. Like it's actually kind of in a way like an interesting scientific project to like study LLMs and see like to what degree what do they know, what does that tell us? It's, for him it was kind of surprising, maybe, why should sentences actually, have we learned that sentences aren't that hard to construct? But then maybe is creativity more difficult? Did we think before that creativity, there was some more creativity in like the construction of a single sentence than we thought? So anything to say on these topics?
It's a lot. Great topics. And where to begin? Guess anywhere. So, I guess I don't want to imply at all that these systems are not powerful. I guess when I say like the power, in a way, it's almost the opposite of the point. It's like the way we're so amazingly sample efficient. I know this is debated, but I think Hinton is mistaken in saying that basically like they're learning a lot more than us with a lot less. I don't think that's correct, because hey, ChatGPT, go tell my robot embodiment what to do, and as I go make a sandwich for myself later, it's gonna have a hard time doing that. There's a lot of knowledge in there, but we do. So I do think we are like remarkably, as people have been saying for a long time, sample efficient, and the there seems something I've been wondering, and I've been asking linguistic friends about this, is to what degree has cultural evolution and like our use of language, like has it been sculpted for us to be able to be remarkably intelligent with it without having to actually need to, like, so I was talking earlier about the synergy of like grounding the symbols with something like our real-time like hallucination of the cat, and it's likely cat things are happening. But it seems also that language has been selected to be able to be amazingly powerful without that. And that would make some sense, because it would give you more degrees of freedom in terms of, like, as you're imagining, your attention drifts from here to there, you can kind of loop back around. And so having like some of like ability, I guess, what would you say, like to cyranoid, or to like just generate like meaningful things without actually ever modeling anything in terms of a causal sequence.
Ah.
There seems to be a lot. So now, if language is structured that way, and what we've talked about are meaningful things in terms of causal sequences on different levels of scale being pursued in different combinations, these systems could inherit a ton. And there does seem, and their power of just like from their scale and the elegance of the architecture of being able to do something like construct hierarchical models of some that are fit for purpose across a lot of different domains. Like, I don't want to be like disparaging language models in their power there. The is the final.
One thing I wanted to say on that is I really like you bringing in that language as well. It is a kind of tool, a technology, the way we use it. And so, and just thinking about my own experience as you kind of said it, I mean, it's known in the cognitive science that it can help us remember things. And yeah, we're pointing to things. And it makes me kind of want to say that, if you look, for example, like there are ways in which we can use language that kind of, it's not very, you think about like the way people like politicians or things use it, you can wield language in a way that like you don't actually mean anything. So there's a way in which, but so I guess I want to point to a kind of a way in which humans kind of, there is a kind of underlying, you could call it like a meaning or a logos, a way in which we're pointing towards them, which is kind of in us. It's kind of what I'm thinking. But like, and so we kind of use words to try and get at that and like sculpt at it. But yeah, it kind of aids us to it. It can kind of help pull us towards it as a technology. Um, and I I don't know how that then understanding of language helps us kind of understand LLMs. So
It's such a
we,
different case. There are
yeah.
ways in which they're produced. Like there's some elements. It's like GPT-2 was in some ways more similar to our cognition about language than GPT like 3, but like you got rid of the bidirectional because then that lets you feed the whole internet to it. But this kind of like looking ahead and looking back, there was actually like a greater cognitive plausibility, even though it was kind of limited still in the previous one. So it's so different. Like there is a sense
Mm,
in which we are doing just next token prediction in some ways, but no. It's
mm,
but so that they arrived at this place of like of prowess in use uh, by such different means. It's like it really is unclear where we're at. And just but from earlier, I don't think we'll resolve it now, but that's an issue that really fascinates me that you mentioned about like the way that you can take these systems and also redeploy them. So it's like the kind of like one-shot inference, like for like taking like a convolutional network and lopping off the top layer, and then look, it's good at other things. Well, that makes some sense because, or it's good for other vision tasks if it's within domain, because you've built up this like library of like basis functions that are flexibly that can be reconfigured in different combinations, and it's useful just as much in this next domain and doesn't require a lot of experience to like make use of this ontology of patterns, this hierarchy, this library. But for the language model to be usefully redeployed, it's like, I don't know the extent to which it's like, to what degree are you like optimizing for certain types of like virtual machine like architectural motifs? Like there's like a kind of small worldness to the dependencies that gets induced, and that's part of it. To what degree is it something like even things like conceptual knowledge that are helpful for solving inverse problems of vision are kind of creeping in, like something, it's like objectness kind of like creeps in the back door. I'm so I personally have no idea what's going on there, and I think that's like an amazing uh, that's like a
yeah.
real. I want to know that.
We maybe kind of relatedly in like, because a helpful thing, as you kind of say, like a helpful thing for cognition, for understanding the world, would be consciousness. And in trying to understand like could an AI be conscious, I think maybe when we talked like weeks or even months ago, we off the air we talked about, can we like or maybe I'm hallucinating this, but I was hearing as well people using integrated information theory, the theory of consciousness, like can you apply that to AIs and like think about just through information processing and I don't know, I guess with LLMs then would that maybe not be as integrated? I'm not sure. And And I don't go on.
I think like Julio and like the other IET theorists would say like they would say no for at least the reason that the architectures still involve a von Neumann bottleneck, and that if that basically that the nature of that serialization prevents the kind of recurrence of effective connectivity you would need to have a system that is meaningfully self-entangled, that has like this kind of as I might say irreducible self-cause effect power on itself, where it's sensitive to both big and small things and has this uh, high capacity to make a difference to its own future evolution, um, and 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 uh, and where small differences within it make a big difference of the difference between what was past and what's to come. And so they would argue that basically unless you have like a certain type of recurrence or feedback on the level of physics, that you that's impossible. And so the language models would be an example of like this dissociation of a highly intelligent system that's very clearly a zombie system. I tend to think they're probably right about language models like being zombies, but I don't. I do wonder whether there's some big questions about the nature of the physical and why causal sequences have to happen at the level of physics when we're still always coarse graining at the level of physics. Like, what do we mean by physics? Like, I feel like we're overly reifying causation there and conflating it with something like a conservation law. Because really, as I understand it, it's a bookkeeping and explanation scheme that we use. And we have a bunch of them that are differently useful in different contexts. So it's like you might do Pearlian causation with these graphs. You might do like Eric Cole's method of like maximizing channel capacity for coarse graining the system. There's all sorts of ways we use causation as a concept. So that to say, no, only the causation at the level of physics is real. Which physics? I'm not so sure. Maybe by the time you consider basically what you're trying to explain, like when you consider some systems, the ways in which they achieve information closure, the maximal explanation might include things like virtual machines. Like economies are quite real, you know, but yeah. So a dyed-in-the-wool IIT theorist would say no. I think IIT is amazing as like for informing conversations about consciousness, as long as it's not the only voice. They don't like that, but I think that they might. I would part ways on saying that just because of tentatively that just because of von Neumann bottleneck is involved, you're necessarily dealing with an unconscious system. I'm agnostic on that issue.
Yeah, yeah, and I like that you bring up something like an economy because I've been kind of thinking a lot about collective intelligences and systems beyond beyond well collections of humans. There was a great um conversation that Roy Baumeister and Michael Levin had on their his own sort of academic channel, and maybe he was at the end of that, and it's not too public their channels. So he was, Michael Levin was kind of, I don't care what I'm gonna. He was gonna say it anyway. He was thinking about, maybe there is a kind of experience that a nation might have because, for him, a logic, you talked about him studying like simple, code blocks, and he's even thinking, can you test the weather? I mean, we just haven't done it. It's kind of an empirical question. To what degree does it have competencies? Could it like learn? I mean, one argument I hear for why it's not reasonable to think of like high agencies as having an experience is that it's just like the speed of connections in something like a brain it's just too great to be replicated. But it's an interesting question. I've even talked to like one scientist, people in like developmental sort of theory, thinking about multifractal dynamics of like how different limbs and different parts of our body are kind of coordinated, and you can kind of even measure that the way they're coordinated. And so it's that could even be an empirical question. Like you can actually just measure like to what degree are different parts of bigger systems coordinated, and I wonder what that would tell us about the intelligence of them. Do you have you thought of,
The speed of the signaling of the system and like the pressures you're putting on it for like the synchronization manifolds within it, like what coordination tasks must it do, like just giving something a body and then requiring, just for the sake of coherent kinematics, that the system like achieve a kind of agreement or closure with respect to this engagement with the physical world, like that could put pressure, but also like the kind of architecture, like something like small worldness. So like it's possible, like, if you look at like the causal flows through an economy, or I imagine it has a small world structure, and probably without it, it wouldn't have enough cohesion that we would even like call it a thing and have a word for it potentially, like in terms. But that's not necessarily enough in terms of like the economy as a whole might not have like the body politic might not be enough for like it to have a tight enough coordination that it's entailing data structures, which there's a dual description for an information geometry, which would say, yeah, that's like an experience. It might be like some combination of architectural features and the nature of the coordination that's required.
Interesting. Since we've been talking a bit about AI, a related thing I'm interested in is personality theory. And since we've been talking about dynamical systems, information processing, like a way, it's going to be an easy way to introduce personality theory, but it's interesting. Do you think an AI could have a personality, like say big fives and things? Because if we so how would you think about personality in general, and could be applied to AI?
So most of my thinking has been informed by this person, Colin DeYoung, who was a student of Jordan Peterson a long time ago, and he's done both really interesting. He's done a lot of work. Colin's polymathic, but like some of it has been on like the structure of the Big Five trait hierarchy and actually showing more details to it. Like it has a hierarchical structure. So like above the Big Five domains, you'll have these meta traits of the shared variance of these different Big Five domains. So it's stability would be the shared variance of consciousness, agreeableness, and inverse neuroticism.
Conscientiousness, yeah.
And the inverse of it actually seems to look like the general psychopathology factor, and that if your stability is low, that's like the most impactful thing potentially you could know about someone's outcomes. I have a slight disagreement with Robin Card Harris and Carl about this issue, and that they're identifying. So there's another factor that's a shared variance of openness and extroversion that's called plasticity, and it has more to do with like psychological flexibility and exploratoriness, and also important. But the P factor is actually more closely related to the stability of the system and its internal coherence, rather than like its flexible functioning. Both are clearly essential. But other things he's found are like there's a lower level, finer grain factor structure. So, for instance, each of the Big Five trait domains will have, and John Vervaeke has addressed this also in interesting ways. He has something called inactivist Big Five theory. But there are these, each Big Five trait domain has a finer level, two aspects underneath it. And if you look at things like trying to explain differences between like people of different genders or political affiliations, at the Big Five trait domain, the differences are just okay. But when you go to the aspect level, they're crushing. It's like the D statistics are like 2.4 or something. So, so he's done interesting work there. But the overall contextualization is that he interprets the Big Five as revealing the
But
functioning of a cybernetic system, a goal-seeking system, and he reinterprets each of these domains and at every level as basically helping a goal-seeking system do what it needs to do in terms of engage with the world, keeping its goal states, being sensitive to error, staying on the goal, being sensitive to the right types of information, or but not too sensitive. And so this account, though, once we're talking cybernetics, it would be any system. It would be, you could talk about the personality if you of any dynamical system you wanted, ranging from an economy. There's some interesting work on like tight and loose cultures. I forget her name, but amazing researchers showing like the personality of an entire nation in terms of like its stability and plasticity. I'll remember that later. I should remember that. And then, but you could go to the personality of a paramecium in terms of like different paramecium might have different response tendencies, and so and similarly for an AI system.
but it's interesting because so you mentioned Colin DeYoung, who's done work on, for example, fleshing out the Big Five theory, and he was talking about how the different traits are kind of evolved in a way for different purposes. purposes, and you can kind of see them in the brain too, and try and think about what. So, for example, extroversion as being sort of an adaptation for positive reward, and neuroticism negative, and but it doesn't necessarily have to be one that evolved naturally through natural selection, because you would assumedly those same kinds of positive negative reward, if they're social, they'll have the trait agreeableness. So then I could imagine, just by virtue of how the world is structured, the same traits and the trait structures might get recapitulated. I mean, what would you think about that? I mean, could there be, it's interesting because you can actually even do studies whereby you look at animals that aren't social, and they'll have neuroticism, extroversion, but then they won't have agreeableness. They won't have a domain trait that is to do with sociality, which makes sense.
Like not all animals need to
the
coherence of their goal hierarchies, and that they're pursuing every goal at any given instance, and not accidentally hyperbolically discounting utility by going after a shiny thing.
Right.
So I think that's in a way, it's one of the key questions about alignment too. But this idea of there's a sense in which we would expect some elements of these, they're universality classes for cybernetic systems in a way. You would expect, regardless of the particular details of realization, there would be a certain set of challenge and a certain set of tendencies and configurations that would be more or less adaptive for the types of environments that a system finds itself in. And then the question is, how universal are they? So it's any system will face a stability plasticity dilemma, but not every system will face a conscientiousness dilemma. And some systems, you put in a multi-agent context, you can think of a thing like an agreeability dimension, but to what extent will it function similarly in terms of the overall, also the overall, even the hierarchical structure of the Big Five, that could that would likely almost certainly vary a lot across the different types of systems. But there still might be a surprising amount of commonality that gives us purchase in understanding those systems and modeling them, and could potentially eventually be important for integrating them into society.
Since I bring up personality and AI, and then something I talked with Maxwell Ramstead about, which is to what degree will AI look like us? We talk about maybe they need to be embodied and agential to kind of have to have real world inference, and that to be able to gain real knowledge and maybe have a perspective and things. And so, I mean, to what degree? I think this is Michael Levin has talked a lot about this. Maybe the main thing that we will build is things that will they'll be squishy though. They'll kind of be like us. Maybe they'll be made out of biology, given his work on the fact that you can't actually strip away the very lower level intelligence and inferences that things like cells do, and you think it's just the connections between them, but then there's a kind of competence even to that, and so maybe you need that kind of structure. But then I don't know. I mean, because one question I had when you talk about personality is, well, if you develop AI so different from us that they almost have different affordances and different availabilities in the world, I mean, maybe they have different whole new personality traits because they almost perceive and interact with the world in a different way. So to what degree will AI be sort of similar to us versus different? And maybe that's a question more broadly about intelligences in the universe as a whole. To what degree do they need to be similar versus how different can environments be, but nevertheless you still get intelligence? Easy questions.
I wish I do. I mean, to what degree? I have opinions, but it's hard to have certainty at this stage. But to what degree is the space of achievable minds a much broader space? And then the kinds of, so then just to achieve AGI, to what extent are we liberated from constraints, and to what extent are we more constrained? To what extent, to get a multi-scale competent system, to what extent does this multi-scale competency afford so much phenotypic plasticity that you're actually much more flexible in the range of capable implementations you could deploy? But maybe also it could in order for the sub-elements of a multi-scale competence system, even though each one is doing its best to adjust, there still might be some coherent harmonics and some that aren't. It still could be like, to get like the cross-level dependencies, you could be deconstrained by the competency below, and that often seems to be the case, like with the plenary examples. But sometimes you might be more constrained just to make everyone play the same song together harmoniously. The coupling of the competence systems, you still could be in a fairly limited set of regimes. So, like for instance, like certain core processes for life management. So, like a general having your circulation function, like your heart, like across scales, like our heart needs to function, and this now is creating like choke points that is like potentially limiting the kinds of configuration that can be there. Like it's uh, this may now bring more of a kind of like a alignable coherence for all of these. Like even though each system has its degrees of freedom, they all have to like sing to the same tune based on these bottlenecks for survival and the preconditions for their coordination. So that could induce greater similarity. I guess the one final one would be um, uh, so what's the shape of the engineering space in terms of like possibility, but also desirability? So let's say we do have like agents with very different ways of life, and then have very different personalities. Then their competence could be an issue. You know, like so then the question, so for alignment, do we need systems that have very similar personalities to us, or is it okay to have a greater diversity of systems with very different personalities, but none of them are particularly threatening, even in aggregate? So, yeah.
Yeah, very interesting. And there's this the way I'm thinking as you bring that up. There's like these multi-scale considerations on like one individual level, the constraints and affordances of like its intelligence, and how there are some limitations like in us, like we like as Jordan Peterson says, like in any game, you have to set the rules of the game, but then that allows you to do things, and that gives you possibilities. Similarly with like how you create an intelligences, but then also on the meta level of like an economy of AIs, you kind of need to think about how they all interact too. So very interesting. Um, one topic I wanted to, because you've done some work on it, is trying to understand psychedelic experiences, psychedelics, and whether is there a simple way to think about all of them? I mean, sometimes I was talking to philosopher of mind Peter Georgette Hughes, and he kind of sometimes it's easy to sort of group them all in psychedelics, and sometimes I read papers on them and it's very coarse graining what they do. They do this and that. Is that, and I don't know if that's the relevant feature. How are you supposed to? I mean, part of you look at the questionnaires that they even give people about psychedelics, and they're to do with ineffability and the fact that you can't describe them. So there's a weird tension in then trying to study them and say, we kind of appreciate what's going on in the brain and the mind. But how would you think about them?
Um, Actually, I love what you said, because like it's the same tension I'm having, and that like and it's throughout. It's like I want both like the best unified understanding, but I'm very nervous about losing granularity. And so like in general, I've been like kind of like on a mission to have people like be a little bit more careful in saying psychedelics do X. I'd want to say like this compound at this substance at this dose in this set and setting might do like more of those kinds of stories. That being said, like as you're saying from these questionnaires, there does seem to be like a really interesting, like deeply interesting in terms of meaningful and potentially relevant to some of our core meanings, phenomenological overlap across a lot of different substances. There seems to be, some of it's by mechanism. So it's like the different classic psychedelics all acting in the 5-HT2A system, that they would do similar things, is not too inexplicable. But there's also some overlap between other things that use radically different mechanisms with overlap, but like things like high dose ketamine or mescaline is slightly different beast, but or like an ecstasy experience. Should we even call that psychedelic? For me, I tend to like so I like a lot of like this rebus model that Robin and Carl put forward of relaxed beliefs under psychedelics. What I've been suggesting, and I'm currently in revisions, wish me luck for the paper, is something in that spirit, but saying the way we want to, if we're interested in using predictive processing for getting purchase on psychedelics, we're going to want to look for different combinations of both directly and indirectly relaxed and strengthened beliefs at different levels of a belief hierarchy in order to have an adequate explanation. We should not expect relaxation throughout. We should not expect strengthening throughout, but we should expect different admixtures of strengthening and relaxation, both directly and indirectly. Because like, in a predictive processing hierarchy, you can get things like these circular looping effects. So it's like on another level, like making that prediction less precise can potentially cause like the lower levels to change their dynamics in ways where they come more into the fore, and those beliefs like relaxing higher levels can strengthen lower levels and things like that.
Yeah. And that would make more sense in exploring sort of vaster, more complex possibility spaces. It wouldn't really make sense to just have a uniform kind of strengthening and relaxing. Okay. Yeah, I kind of interrupted you. Yeah.
No. So that's the account, and then basically so like in that paper, the goal is basically saying, okay, so the predictive processing story might be a little bit more complicated than has been suggested. And to actually have an adequate account, we're going to want to basically work our way up to perceptual synthesis, conscious experience. And we're also going to want to work our way up to sequences of conscious experiences, streams of experience, and cognition in terms of the flow of thought and the way that's altered. And that's what like an adequate explanation. That's what we're seeking. But you also mentioned like these questionnaires, like the aspects of phenomenology that are core to it. So it seems like so how do we use words? Like, would it be so for something to be mind manifesting, psychedelic, in a meaningful, interesting way of an altered state of consciousness that we would use this word for? To what extent, for instance, is it just any elevation of consciousness level under a different regime? But then people would say, well, like, wouldn't that be like, you could probably do it with amphetamines, right? So that's different. Do you also need basically the different regime to involve a modification of self? Well, what kind of modification of self? So, in the like the amphetamine example, someone on a high dose amphetamine, for instance, could be like, their self is altered. They're more confident. They're like moving into the thing, but like, and their conscious level is probably elevated. Is that a psychedelic experience? Not really. I think a lot of people would push back on that. They might say it's a psychotomimetic experience. They wouldn't call it a psychedelic experience necessarily. So there seems to be something that kind of coming back to Robin Carl, something about a relaxation of the boundaries of the self, or just an that's a seeming that's this openness to the world of a different kind. Whether it's like you feel in connection to it, like it's you are in the world or it's in you, in what degree? That does be kind of core.
Yeah, and as you say that, it just makes me think like to what degree is that related to the, as you say, the simultaneous sort of relaxing and strengthening of different beliefs. Like maybe if on your first account of that differentials, like changing of precision you give to the beliefs, if that changes the affordances and the way you relate to the world, is that sufficient to explain the account of the self and your relation and understanding of yourself? Because maybe in realizing better genuine affordances with the world or seeing those possibilities, does that but then maybe you could do like the reverse causality. Does a change in how you perceive the meta version of yourself, how does that then change the landscape of affordances and salience that you have? And so interesting. But yeah, those both seem crucial. Okay.
One thing that could be interesting is I've dug in a little bit on this reduction in posterior alpha that's often observed, because some of the sources of alpha coherence. So, like relating back to some of these ideas on consciousness, I tend to interpret different neural rhythms as corresponding to different synchronization manifolds for populations on different scales, and a kind of inverse hierarchy sort of things. Like slower rhythms, that's agreement among tends to be among a broader swath of areas, like more units coming together and communicating. Faster rhythms, more local beliefs. there's complexity, but it's sort of like, kind of like you can have like a quantization of prediction error of like a local belief of like what do we think is happening for like a microcolumn. Maybe that's like refreshing at gamma frequencies. But then if you want to have something like what's going on within this modality for a model of this object, or transmode, but like what's going on in this local model, and then you might have something like beta might correspond to that forming a coherent belief around that. But then as you move up something like alpha, like 10 times, 8 to 12 times a second, what would it take to basically have all of your sensory modalities bring things together and their mutual information and be organized by a coherent egocentric reference frame? There seems to be something potentially special about alpha about that also, in terms of it's refreshing slow enough and big enough of scope that would get you this multimodal integration, which would be helpful for basically what's going on in this world. And also some of the sources of it are basically receiving a lot of this is only the PAPE circuit, but it's this idea of this core circuit of emotional memory that goes from the mammillary bodies, mammillothalamic tract, anterior thalamic nucleus, posterior cingulate, hippocampus, fornix back in. Don't worry about that. But the point is, this core circuit, basically the mammillary bodies, are receiving stretch receptor information from the neck, and then this thalamic relay is also getting the vestibular apparatus telling you the yaw, pitch, and roll. And now this information is coming in to basically a core hub connected to the rest of your sensorium, all the modalities coming together, receiving this stretch, this basically what's my, this giving you this orienting information. And so the idea is that if you disrupt that could potentially change both your sense of afford. That could be a particularly powerful way of changing affordance structures, and even things like the differentiation of you from the world. Actually, making your brain more entropic around these core processes of establishing your ego as a point of view on the world, and that this could be potentially part of why that's associated with so many different psychedelics. That's a particularly powerful modification. That your multimodal sensorium organized according to a coherent egocentric perspective. Inject entropy there, that might be especially likely to make one trip.
Yeah, when you talk with, I was a bit confused by. I mean, it's interesting, but when you talk about like alpha frequencies or different, so there are almost different ways in which information can be processed. So and the way it's all integrated together, like, and I'm interested. So do we know that psychedelics like change this? Would you be able to say a bit more about that?
I don't think we have good models of exactly the link from molecular mechanism to something like neural activity organized on the scale of something like alpha frequencies. A lot of things are unfolding, and a lot of like levels of like organization are happening and moving between those scales, where I think it really challenges trying to make an overly simple story. But like, so for instance, you could try to tell an account akin to what was in the original Rebus model of something like a kind of paradoxical excitement-induced desynchronization. So it's like you increase the gain on these from the 5-HT2A receptors, serotonin receptors. You increase the gain on these layer 5 pyramidal neurons that loop with the thalamus and can shoot for distance, create big synchronous complexes, integrate information from a lot of different sources. And that if you excite them too much, they don't wait for each other to sync up. They fire out of sync, and this relaxes your belief landscape. Is that what's happening at the level of alpha? Potentially. Or you can come up with multiple accounts of then, like, for instance, it could be maybe the beta, like at the level of like beta synchronization underneath alpha in some kind of hierarchy, that got maybe it's the groups of neurons, their predictions are not waiting to come into agreement. And it's not that your individual units are firing out of sync, but it's actually you're getting basically local models that are inconsistent with each other, and that's causing the desync at a higher level. With the same kind of looping causation you just described could potentially apply. So I don't think we know.
So when you say alpha and beta, like is that these are things that we can measure the actual so these are things that we can measure, and then you're saying, well, what story then do we put behind that of like what's going on in the brain, right? Okay, that's
Yeah, we
interesting.
can
Yeah,
measure.
yeah.
We measured, their course measures, but actually, I think that's in a way part of why they might be interesting. I think Carl probably thinks I'm like over interpreting their potential significance to different frequency bands, and I might be. But
Hmm.
the idea that like they represent large scale neuronal coordination that we can measure outside the brain, and there's um, some good evidence that, like, for instance, like there's a different spatial extent associated with these different frequency bands. So now if you're having basically coordinated neural activity of different spatial extents, that and updating on different temporal scales, trying to connect this with many levels and details, the idea is thinking of this as a deep temporal modeling system of sorts. And now the question is exactly what kind. Um, but the I guess the part about alpha would be if you wanted to get something like a construct like ego dissolution. Could a construct like ego dissolution have to do with something like the preconditions partially for egocentric perspective? If I inject entropy into the ways in which I create that perspective, or the ways in which I'm like attributing causes to based on that to either me or the world, could that then seed creative anomalous inferences? Um,
Interesting. Um, you think that relatedly, and I don't won't keep you here for too long asking strange questions, but do you think dreams are like? Do you think similar accounts could help us understand dreams, or what do you think is going on there? In I don't know if you might not have given thought to this, but
no, I mean so in the Albus account, it's currently in a preprint form, but that's been worked on for quite some time. But it's kind of a too long did not read situation with reviewers, I think. But uh, I suggest that actually dreaming might be one of the most profitable ways of framing psychedelics. The idea of like a waking dream where imagination is closer to reality, and some of your reality monitoring protocols are altered in a way that are um, uh, allowing for different modes of cognition. So dreams, there's a sense in which it is kind of like a transient psychosis we all have, and we'll our sense of self within the dream, we forget who we are, and we entertain thoughts we would not entertain otherwise, um, that might not seem realistic or plausible, um, either conditioned on what we think is in the world or on ourselves. And so the idea that this is a framing of the psychedelic states, like absolutely, and that's part of why um, I've been pushing that it's good to also look for strength in beliefs, because it seems there's an elegant account of both hallucinations and delusions as a kind of overstrong inference that's refusing to like basically listen to the contradictory data. It's like a overly rigid paradigm you're having, and um, the and so similarly, kind of for dreams, it's sort of like you are cut off from the sensory environment, and you can think of them as basically your predictions not being in a dialogue with what's going on in the world. And so this is a model of basically, so I mentioned earlier this idea of relaxation, but another interpretation of psychedelics mechanism that could happen at a different level that I think this might be particularly important at intermediate levels that would correspond to something like coherent perceptual synthesis, something like our stream of consciousness. Um, that increasing the gain on the units that shoot for distance and loop with the thalamus might help them to sync up. It might have you have stronger, the creation of form, larger complexes with greater combinatorics um, within limits. And so the idea that this, for instance, could then make your imaginings so vivid that they're more like a dream. Uh, this that sense, quite possibly, or that's my thought.
interesting.
Yeah.
Do you have anything else you wish we'd covered? Any last thoughts on sort of any of the topics that we talked about? There might be something that sort of links them or anything, and if not, thank you. And where can people find your work?
Okay, we might not be able to get into free will this time, but that could be a conversation for another day.
Yes.
And No, I think that we covered some good ground.
Awesome. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, if there's, well, we'd love to cover that. We'll do that another time. This has been great. Yeah. Awesome. I'll put links to some of the papers we talked about in the description. Thank you.
Thank you.